12 years old, a black boy's leg was brutally crushed by a cotton mill. Discarded by society without a single penny, he carved a wooden peg from scrap and transformed himself into Peg Leg Bates, the one-legged tap icon that America turned into a sideshow. The media hailed his survival as an inspiring miracle, but they hid a bloody reality. From the grueling stages of vaudeville to national television, the entertainment machine commercialized his trauma, forcing him to perform bone-crushing leaps for affluent audiences. This is the dark history of a man who had to monetize his own physical agony, smiling on a splintering wooden peg just to earn the right to survive. Clayton Bates was 12 years old. In the Jim Crow South, a black boy of 12 was not viewed as a child. He was viewed as raw, expendable labor. The cottonseed oil industry was highly profitable and notoriously dangerous. The mills operated with exposed gears, heavy leather drive belts, and massive iron augers designed to crush and transport seed. Safety regulations were non-existent for the workers and entirely unimaginable for the black sharecropping families who relied on the mill for their bare survival. Young Clayton worked on this floor, navigating the lethal machinery. His presence in this industrial hazard was not a failure of oversight. It was the intended design of a regional economy built entirely on the exploitation of cheap, vulnerable bodies. The accident was not a stroke of bad luck. It was a statistical certainty waiting to execute its programming. The industrial machinery operated with blind efficiency. The conveyor auger, a massive rotating spiral of forged iron, caught the boy's left leg. The metal did not hesitate. The mechanism drew him in, applying the exact same crushing force to human bone and tissue that it applied to the agricultural harvest. The physical damage was immediate and catastrophic. The iron gears shattered the tibia and fibula, mangling muscle and tearing violently through major arteries. The immediate aftermath was a race against severe blood loss. The workers extracted the mangled 12-year-old and transported him to the nearest medical facility. The local hospital stood as a beacon of modern medicine in the county. It was well lit, fully staffed, and heavily provisioned with surgical equipment. It was also strictly legally segregated. The doors remained locked to Clayton Bates. The administrative policy was absolute. The medical staff, sworn by oath to preserve human life, looked at the bleeding boy and enforced the racial boundaries of the era. They refused him entry. They refused him a sterilized operating room. They refused him basic medical triage. He was carried back to the dilapidated, drafty wooden cabin of his single mother, Emma. The cabin offered barely enough shelter to keep out the evening wind. The central piece of furniture was a narrow, unvarnished wooden kitchen table used for preparing meager meals. This narrow table was rapidly cleared. It became the surgical theater. There were no bright overhead surgical lamps, only the dim flickering glow of a kerosene lantern pushing back the shadows. There was no sterilized environment. Most critically, there was no anesthetic available. A local physician arrived to perform the inevitable amputation. The 12-year-old boy was laid out and pinned down against the rough wood by the adults in the room. The procedure commenced. The surgical saw made contact with the shattered remnants of the left leg. The sound filled the small cabin. It was the rhythmic, metallic scrape of steel teeth biting deep into living bone, echoing sharply against the thin wooden walls. The boy's hands gripped the hard edges of the kitchen table until his knuckles turned entirely white. The floorboards creaked under the shifting weight of the men holding his shoulders and hips down. The air grew heavy with the metallic scent of blood pooling on the kitchen table. overflowing the edges and dripping steadily onto the dirt floor below. The rhythmic grating of the saw stopped only when the limb was entirely severed from the body. When the bleeding was finally staunched and the severed limb removed, the reality of the American economic system settled over the quiet cabin. The mill owners reviewed the incident. A broken conveyor belt or a snapped iron gear would have required a financial investment to repair. The loss of a black child's leg required nothing. The industrial machine registered no fault. Emma Bates received zero compensation. There was no insurance payout, no formal apology, and no financial assistance provided for medical recovery or rehabilitation. The company ledger remained perfectly balanced. The 12-year-old boy survived the kitchen table. He woke up in a society that had already categorized him as industrial waste. He was missing a leg, he possessed no inherited wealth, and he lived under a rigid legal framework designed specifically to suppress his existence. The system assumed the story of Clayton Bates ended on that blood-soaked wood. The physical loss was absolute, rendering him useless to the heavy demands of the cotton mills and the agricultural fields. He was cast out into the extreme margins, fully expected to fade into the quiet, invisible statistics of the segregated South. The silence that followed the amputation in that drafty South Carolina cabin was not a peaceful one. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of economic ruin. In the agrarian, heavily industrialized reality of the 1920s Jim Crow South, physical mobility was the sole currency a working-class black family possessed. Hands were needed to pick cotton, backs were needed to haul lumber, and legs were required to navigate the perilous machinery of the mills. A body that could not perform manual labor was a body the system explicitly designed to discard. The societal expectation for a 12-year-old black amputee was entirely clear, predetermined by decades of racial and economic architecture. He was expected to sit on a dusty street corner with a tin cup, relying on the sparse pity of passers-by until illness or starvation quietly erased him from the census. Immobility was a death sentence. Clayton Bates understood this not as an abstract concept, but as the immediate, terrifying reality of his mother's struggling household. The physical pain of the healing stump, an expanse of raw tissue and severed nerve endings, crudely stitched together without modern surgical finesse, was matched only by the psychological weight of his sudden uselessness. For the first few months, he was confined to crude, whittled crutches. The crutches dragged through the dirt. They forced his shoulders up toward his ears, contorting his posture and turning every yard of movement into a grueling, exhausting physical negotiation with gravity. He watched the able-bodied men walk to the fields and the mills. He recognized that the crutches were a symbol of permanent dependence. To survive, he had to completely eliminate the crutch. He had to reclaim his verticality. The year was 1919, bleeding into 1920. The First World War had recently concluded, spilling its surviving veterans back onto American shores. The streets of major southern towns began to see the return of soldiers, missing arms and legs, casualties of artillery shells and trench warfare. These men, predominantly white, were absorbed back into a society that viewed their missing limbs as badges of ultimate patriotic sacrifice. They were met with government pensions, celebrated in local parades, and fitted with the era's most advanced medical prosthetics, articulated wooden legs with leather sockets crafted by the newly mobilized Veterans Bureau. Bates observed this post-war landscape from the strict confines of the segregated margins. He witnessed the stark disparity between the celebrated hero's injury and the invisible industrial casualty. There would be no government pension for a black child maimed by a cottonseed oil mill. There would be no medically fitted prosthesis. If he wanted to walk, he would have to build the mechanism himself. He would have to forge a tool of survival from the literal refuse of a society that had already deemed him disposable. Historical accounts from his community detail a defining moment of profound resourcefulness. Bates did not seek out a medical professional. He sought out scrap. He acquired a discarded, heavy piece of timber. Some sources suggest it was an abandoned, rudimentary prototype of a prosthetic leg originally intended for a returning World War I veteran. A heavy block of wood that had been deemed too crude or ill-fitting for a recognized soldier. Other accounts point to it being a simple, dense piece of industrial pine or hickory, perhaps salvaged from the very agricultural infrastructure that had destroyed his flesh. The exact origin of the timber matters less than the action he took next. Using nothing more than a basic whittling knife and sheer desperate will, the boy began to sculpt his own foundation. He carved a crude socket into the top of the timber, attempting to match the uneven, tender circumference of his amputated thigh. The engineering was brutal in its simplicity. There was no silicone liner, no pressure-relieving foam, no articulating knee joint to absorb the shock of walking. It was rigid, unforgiving wood meant to bear the full weight of a growing human body. To secure this heavy block of timber to his flesh, he scavenged thick, worn leather straps. These were the kind of heavy-duty belts used to drive the grinding gears of local agricultural machinery, the same rough industrial materials that populated the mill where he lost his leg. He strapped the leather tight around his waist and over his shoulder, binding the dead wood to his living thigh. The initial physical toll of wearing this homemade apparatus was devastating. The friction of the rigid wooden socket against the poorly healed surgical scar tissue caused immediate blistering. The skin would rub raw, bleed, heal into thick calluses, and tear open again under the relentless pressure of his own body weight. Every single step he took sent a jarring, unmitigated shockwave straight up his femur and into his spine. The wood did not bend, it did not yield, it simply struck the earth. Yet through agonizing repetition, he forced his body to adapt. He developed an asymmetrical gait, throwing his weight heavily onto his remaining right leg while swinging the heavy wooden peg forward in a stiff, calculated arc. He had reclaimed his mobility, but walking was not enough. Walking merely brought him back to a baseline of survival. It did not offer an escape from the crushing poverty of his circumstances. The transformation from survival to defiance occurred when he discovered the acoustic properties of his own trauma. Tap dancing, rooted in the complex polyrhythmic traditions of African vernacular dance, the Irish jig and the English clog dance, was a deeply embedded cultural language in the black communities of the South. It was a form of communication, a percussive expression of joy, sorrow, and enduring resilience. The traditional tap dancer relies on perfect bilateral symmetry, 2 flesh and blood legs, 2 ankles capable of rapid articulation, and 2 shoes fitted with metal plates at the toe and heel. The dancer uses this symmetry to execute lightning-fast flurries of sound, shifting weight seamlessly from left to right. Bates possessed no symmetry. His left ankle was gone, replaced by a blunt, immobile block of wood. But as he navigated the wooden floorboards of local porches and the hard-packed dirt of the segregated neighborhoods, he began to listen closely to the sound his homemade leg produced. He realized that the heavy, unyielding nature of the peg was not just a physical anchor, it was a unique percussion instrument. He began to experiment. He fitted a thick piece of rubber to the bottom tip of the wooden peg to provide traction and prevent the leg from violently sliding out from under him on smooth surfaces. He left the rest of the wood exposed. On his remaining right foot, he wore a traditional leather shoe, soon outfitting it with the standard metal tap plates. When he moved, he generated a completely unprecedented acoustic signature. The physics of his movement required an extraordinary reinvention of human biomechanics. Because his left leg could not articulate at the knee or the ankle, he could not perform the standard rapid-fire steps of his able-bodied peers. Instead, he had to rely on immense explosive core strength and the sheer athletic power of his right thigh. To make the peg dance, he had to launch his entire body into the air, suspending his weight for a fraction of a second, and aggressively drive the wooden tip down into the floorboards. The sound he produced was startling. It was an asymmetrical, aggressive polyrhythm. The right foot provided the sharp, high-frequency, metallic clack, clack, clack of standard tap. But the left side, the side of his profound loss, answered with a deep, resonant, hollow thud. It sounded like a heavy mallet striking a drum. Clack, tap, thud, clack, clack, thud, slide. It was a heavy, industrial beat. The rhythm of the cottonseed oil mill, the mechanical grinding tempo of the machinery that had crushed his bone, was subconsciously absorbed and violently reappropriated into his performance. He was stomping the rhythm of the machine that tried to kill him into the floorboards. He began to perform on street corners, outside local barber shops, and in the dusty squares of Fountain Inn. He did not dance with the smooth, gliding grace of the era's traditional performers. His dance was athletic, fierce, and visually shocking. He would leap high into the air, completely horizontal to the ground, and land with crushing force directly onto the wooden peg, spinning on the rubber tip with terrifying velocity. He performed deep knee bends on his single right leg, dropping his body entirely to the floor and exploding back up in a single fluid motion, while the peg leg hammered out a relentless bass line. This was no longer a child merely trying to walk. This was an individual weaponizing his physical deficit. The Jim Crow Society demanded that a disabled black boy remain invisible, quiet, and subservient. Bates refused. He took the ugliest, most traumatic element of his existence, the wooden stump that branded him as a victim of industrial slaughter, and turned it into the loudest, most undeniable spectacle in the room. He forced the able-bodied world to stop, gather around, and stare not with pity, but with absolute mesmerized astonishment. The local crowds began to throw coins. The sheer novelty of the one-legged dancer, combined with a rhythmic complexity that fully able-bodied dancers struggled to replicate, created an immediate visceral demand. He was generating income, pulling his mother out of the immediate threat of starvation. The scrap wood from a discarded veteran had become a tool of economic leverage. However, this street-level success caught the attention of men who understood how to industrialize raw spectacle. The coins tossed onto the dirt roads of South Carolina were mere fractions of pennies compared to the immense capital flowing through the organized entertainment circuits of the 1920s. Bates had successfully forged a weapon to defend his own humanity, but in doing so, he had unknowingly sculpted the exact product that the sprawling predatory machinery of American vaudeville was desperate to consume. The society that had severed his leg and offered no compensation was now keenly interested in purchasing the rights to watch him dance on the wreckage. He was about to leave the dusty street corners and step onto the formalized, heavily contracted stages of a system that would prove far more dangerous and far more systematically exploitative than the iron gears of the cotton mill. The transition from the dusty street corners of South Carolina to the formal stages of American theater did not represent an escape from exploitation. It was merely a shift in the architecture of the machinery. By the mid-1920s, the coins tossed onto the dirt by local crowds were replaced by formal ink-stained contracts. Clayton Bates had been discovered by the talent scouts of the era. He was absorbed into the Theater Owners Booking Association, universally known as the TOBA circuit. To the white men who owned the infrastructure, TOBA was a highly efficient, sprawling network of 80 to 100 theaters, stretching across the American South, the Eastern Seaboard, and the Midwest. It was a monopoly designed to extract maximum profit from black performers catering to segregated black audiences. To the artists trapped within its ironclad contracts, the acronym held a distinctly different meaning. They called it tough on black artists. Other performers, broken by its relentless demands, translated it simply as treats us bad always. Bates did not sign these contracts under the illusion of artistic elevation. He signed them because the alternative in a Jim Crow society was vagrancy, starvation, or a return to the lethal industrial sector that had already claimed his limb. He possessed a highly marketable skill, and the Toba syndicates were eager to purchase it. However, the exact nature of what they were buying reveals the deep, cynical mechanics of early 20th century entertainment. The white promoters managing the Toba circuit were not primarily investing in Bates's complex polyrhythmic tap technique. They were not paying for his deep understanding of syncopation or the athletic brilliance of his right foot. They were purchasing the blunt wooden peg attached to his left thigh. They were buying a medical anomaly. The American entertainment industry in the 1920s was still heavily infected by the legacy of the 19th century freak show. Vaudeville thrived on the novelty act. In the strictly codified hierarchy of the stage, singers and comedians held the respectable tiers. Below them were the chorus dancers, occupying a separate, highly profitable, but deeply degrading category were the novelties, the extremely tall, the extremely small, the bearded, and the amputated. A black man in this era was already legally codified as a second-class citizen. A disabled black man was stripped of his humanity entirely and repackaged as a biological curiosity. Look at the surviving promotional broadsides and theater posters from this era. The bold, heavy typography did not read Clayton Bates, Master of the Tap. The posters were smeared with sensationalist ink, screaming titles like The One-Legged Wonder and The Peg-Legged Phenomenon. The visual hierarchy of the advertising deliberately minimized his face and his artistry, drawing the viewer's eye downward to a crude, often exaggerated illustration of his wooden stump. The promoters were not selling a dance recital. They were selling a circus exhibit. They understood a dark, fundamental truth about the theater-going public. Audiences would pay a premium to stare at trauma, provided it was packaged as entertainment. The ticket price was an admission fee to gaze safely upon a victim of severe industrial violence, performing physical impossibilities. Bates was required to walk onto the stage not as an artist, but as a living, breathing freak show. His disability, the very thing that had rendered him economically useless to the cottonseed oil mill, had officially been transformed into a highly lucrative commercial commodity. The daily reality of delivering this commodity was a masterclass in physical and psychological endurance. The Toba circuit demanded an impossible volume of labor, A standard contract required performers to deliver 3 to 4 shows a day, every single day of the week, including holidays. There were no understudies. There were no sick days. If a performer missed a cue or failed to complete a set, the theater managers levied exorbitant fines that were immediately deducted from their already meager wages. If a performer complained about the conditions, they were blacklisted across the entire 80 theater network, effectively ending their ability to earn a living in the United States. The conditions inside the theaters were brutal. These were not the plush, velvet-lined palaces of the white vaudeville circuits. Toba theaters were often poorly maintained, drafty caverns. The dressing rooms were unheated in the winter and suffocatingly hot in the summer, frequently lacking basic plumbing. More critically for Bates, the stages themselves were hazardous. A traditional tap dancer requires a smooth, predictable wooden floor to glide and execute rapid strikes. Toba stages were notoriously uneven, riddled with splinters, warped boards, and exposed nails. For a man launching his entire body weight into the air and landing on a single rigid wooden peg topped with a piece of salvaged rubber, a warped floorboard was not just an inconvenience, it was a physical threat. If the rubber tip caught an uneven plank during a high-velocity spin, the torque would instantly transfer up the unbending wooden shaft, threatening to shatter his femur or tear the scarred tissue of his amputation site. Every performance was a high-stakes calculation of physics and risk, executed flawlessly under blinding, inadequate stage lighting. When the curtain fell and the fourth show of the day concluded, the exploitation simply shifted locations. The infrastructure of the Jim Crow South dictated how the performers traveled between the cities. They were barred from hotels, forcing them to seek out boarding houses in the segregated districts, or, more frequently, sleep directly on the trains. The railway journey was its own specific form of systemic violence. State laws mandated strictly segregated travel. The designated Jim Crow car was universally placed at the very front of the passenger section, situated directly immediately behind the steam locomotive. This placement was not accidental. It ensured that the black passengers bore the brunt of the engine's exhaust. As the trains rattled through the southern nights, the windows of the segregated carriage had to remain open for ventilation in the stifling heat. Heavy, thick clouds of black coal smoke, toxic sulfur, and burning cinders poured directly into the cabin. The performers called these carriages rolling smokehouses. Bates, physically exhausted from pounding his wooden leg into the stage floor 4 times a day, was forced to sleep sitting upright on hard wooden benches, breathing in the abrasive coal dust. The soot settled into his clothes, his hair, and the pores of his skin. The vibration of the train tracks jarred the raw, heavily calloused skin where his thigh met the wooden socket, denying him any physiological recovery. He would arrive in the next city at dawn, his lungs heavy with coal ash, his muscles cramped from the wooden benches. He would carry his heavy bags down the platform, walk to the next dilapidated theater, strap the wooden peg tightly to his scarred leg, and wait in the freezing dressing room. When the stage manager called his name, the system required him to walk out under the lights, bury the physical agony of the journey, and deliver the explosive, smiling, high-energy spectacle of the one-legged wonder. Bates was fully aware of the mechanics of this exploitation. He was not a naive participant. He understood that the promoters were mining his physical deficit for capital, taking the lion's share of the ticket sales while paying him pennies on the dollar. He knew the audiences were staring at the stump before they listened to the rhythm. Yet he engaged with the machinery. He stepped into the Toba slaughterhouse and weaponized the very morbid curiosity that sought to degrade him. He allowed them to advertise a freak show, but the moment he struck the floorboards, he delivered a master class in syncopated percussion that defied their narrow categorizations. He forced the harsh, grinding rhythm of the cotton mill out of his wooden leg and into the ears of the paying public. He traded his physical comfort and submitted to the degrading labels of the vaudeville posters because he was executing a long-term strategy of survival. The system demanded a novelty act to consume. Bates provided it, silently extracting the wages he needed to build his foundation, heavily guarding the psychological core of his humanity while the theater owners cashed the checks. The physical commodification of his missing limb was complete, but the societal manipulation of his image was only just beginning. The ascent from the grueling Toba circuit to the polished elite stages of northern cities marked a significant shift in Clayton Bates's career trajectory. Yet it introduced a far more insidious psychological trap. By the 1930s, the raw, percussive power of his performance had broken through the regional confines of the segregated South. He secured bookings at the apex of American nightlife. He was dancing under the blinding marquees of Broadway and the opulent, smoke-filled rooms of Harlem's most exclusive venues. The audiences transformed. The exhausted black workers of the TOBA train routes were replaced by wealthy, white, high society patrons, cloaked in diamonds and tailored tuxedos. The financial compensation multiplied exponentially. The industrial machinery of the American entertainment complex had fully recognized the profitability of his unique rhythm. However, this elevation in status required a strict, heavily curated public persona. The mainstream press of the era, operating within a deeply entrenched racial hierarchy, needed a palatable framework to present a disabled black man to a white audience. They could not present him as a victim of brutal, unregulated Southern capitalism. Doing so would force a confrontation with the ugly realities of the industrial economy that generated their own wealth. Instead, the media conglomerates systematically constructed a far more comforting narrative. They built the archetype of the overcomer. The printing presses churned out a specific, highly sanitized version of his life. Headlines splashed across newspapers, including prominent publications like the Chicago Defender, celebrated his willpower-conquering handicap. Feature articles focused obsessively on his relentless cheerfulness, his unshakable smile, and his refusal to be defeated by a missing limb. The language used by journalists and theater promoters was drenched in the vocabulary of miraculous individual triumph. The boy who was mutilated by a cottonseed oil mill was erased. In his place stood a shining metallic symbol of the American dream, a man who had allegedly pulled himself up by a single wooden bootstrap. This narrative framing functioned as a deeply calculated mechanism of social control. The 1930s were defined by the Great Depression. The working classes were devastated, unemployment was rampant, and early civil rights movements were beginning to vocalize fierce demands for systemic equality and social safety nets. The establishment required a distraction, and the image of Clayton Bates provided a perfect, unassailable counter-argument. His heavily publicized success was weaponized against his own community. The underlying unspoken message broadcast to the struggling masses was ruthlessly clear. Society pointed to the man spinning furiously on a wooden peg and silently demanded, If a black man missing half his physical foundation can achieve wealth and international acclaim through sheer individual effort, what excuse do the able-bodied poor possess for their poverty? The overcomer trope effectively absolved the system of all responsibility. It shifted the entire burden of survival onto the shoulders of the traumatized individual. The media demanded that Bates embody an impossible saint-like stoicism. He was required to be endlessly grateful for the opportunity to perform. He was forbidden from expressing any bitterness regarding the hospital that had locked its doors to him, the mill owners who had discarded him, or the daily physical agony of his profession. The public purchased the right to be inspired by his smile, and the strict condition of that purchase was his absolute silence regarding his suffering. This forced public gratitude created a jarring, violent psychological paradox, which played out every single night within the architecture of the theaters themselves. The famous Cotton Club in Harlem served as the ultimate manifestation of this hypocrisy. The venue was the epicenter of Jazz Age glamour, showcasing the most brilliant black artistic talent of the generation. Yet, it operated under a strictly enforced policy of racial segregation. The patrons, sitting at the tables drinking expensive bootlegged champagne, were exclusively white. When Bates stepped onto the polished floorboards of these premium stages, he commanded absolute reverence. The elite audiences fell silent, mesmerized by the rhythmic velocity of his performance. They showered him with standing ovations, roaring their approval for the peg-leg wonder. For those 15 minutes in the spotlight, he was a king, entirely controlling the emotional temperature of the room. He defied gravity, executing aerial leaps and lightning-fast percussive strikes that able-bodied dancers could not comprehend. He was the highest-paid black dancer in the country, generating massive revenue for the venue owners. The illusion shattered the precise moment the music stopped and he retreated behind the heavy velvet curtain. The geography of the theater was designed to immediately strip him of his elevated status. The stage was a temporary suspension of Jim Crow laws. The backstage area was an aggressive reaffirmation of them. Despite being the marquee headliner, he was subjected to the same degrading spatial restrictions as the lowest paid staff member. He was strictly prohibited from using the main entrances of the venues he was selling out. He was forced to navigate dark, garbage-strewn alleyways to access the service doors, hauling his heavy wooden leg up narrow, poorly lit back staircases. The dressing rooms assigned to black performers in these elite white clubs were often cramped. Unventilated closets located close to the boiler rooms or the kitchens. The most humiliating daily reminder of his manufactured status occurred during the simple act of seeking sustenance. After concluding a physically devastating performance that left him soaked in sweat and trembling from exertion, he could not simply walk into the venue's dining room and order a meal. The same wealthy patrons who had just bruised their hands applauding his genius would have recoiled at the sight of him sitting at an adjacent table. The management enforced strict boundaries. Bates, the star of the show, was routinely required to walk out the back door, navigate the alley, and purchase food from the kitchen service window, eating from a paper plate while standing in the shadows. This was the true crushing weight of the miracle society had constructed around him. He was forced to constantly navigate two entirely incompatible realities. He was an internationally celebrated icon of human resilience, yet he remained a second-class citizen, completely vulnerable to the daily, petty indignities of racial segregation. He had to absorb the applause of the white establishment while simultaneously absorbing their contempt. The mental endurance required to sustain this duality was immense. He could not afford the luxury of righteous anger. A single public outburst, a single moment of refusing to play the grateful, smiling overcomer would have resulted in immediate professional exile. The white promoters who controlled access to the stages would have instantly labeled him difficult or ungrateful, effectively cutting off the financial lifeline he had built for his family. He was trapped in a gilded cage built from his own physical trauma. The wooden leg that had saved him from starvation was now tethered to a media narrative that demanded total psychological submission. He smiled through the standing ovations. He smiled while exiting through the service doors, and he smiled while eating his dinner in the alleyways. The American public consumed the myth of the overcomer with ravenous appetite, completely insulated from the silent, exhausting reality of the man forced to carry that myth on a single splintering block of wood. The system had successfully commercialized his pain, sanitized his history, and packaged his existence into a comfortable, deeply dishonest moral lesson. The ultimate phase of this manipulation was rapidly approaching as the advent of television prepared to broadcast his forced smile into millions of living rooms, weaponizing his image on a scale the theater owners could have never imagined. The advent of the 1950s brought a profound technological shift that fundamentally altered the architecture of American celebrity. The physical boundaries of the vaudeville theater, with its limited seating and regional isolation, were suddenly obliterated by the cathode ray tube. Television had arrived, and it was rapidly colonizing the living rooms of the American middle class. This was not merely a new method of broadcasting entertainment. It was a centralized, immensely powerful apparatus for forging a unified national identity. At the absolute epicenter of this cultural monopoly stood the Ed Sullivan Show. Broadcast live from New York City on the CBS network, Sullivan's stage was the supreme validator of talent in the mid-20th century. An appearance on this program did not just guarantee national fame, it conferred institutional legitimacy. Clayton Bates did not simply appear on the Ed Sullivan Show, he became a foundational pillar of its variety programming. Archival records indicate he performed on the national broadcast more than 20 times, an unprecedented record for a black performer with a severe physical disability. The visual impact of these broadcasts was electrifying. The heavy multi-lens RCA television cameras would push in for high-contrast black and white close-ups as Bates engaged in furious, high-stakes tap challenges against fully able-bodied legends of the era. The framing was deliberate and highly dramatic. The cameras would capture the blinding speed of a traditional dancer's 2 feet, executing flawless, rapid-fire syncopation. Then, the lens would cut sharply to Bates. He was wearing a sharply tailored tuxedo, his posture impeccably straight, his smile radiating an invincible charm. He would launch his body into the air, completely defying the gravitational limitations of his missing limb. The acoustic pickup of the television studio microphones captured the unique, heavy, percussive detonation of his wooden peg striking the stage floor. He executed the jet plane, his signature move, leaping 5.5 feet into the air, hovering for a breathless fraction of a second, and crashing down on the single wooden point with explosive precision. To the 20 million Americans watching from the comfort of their suburban sofas, it was a display of superhuman athleticism. It was television magic. However, beneath the surface of this primetime spectacle lay a deeply cynical, highly calculated political utility. To mid-century America, Bates was the perfect, unassailable symbol. The American establishment required a highly visible counter-narrative to the growing civil rights movement, and his televised triumphs offered a comforting illusion, a proof of pure meritocracy that conveniently erased the systemic violence necessitating his struggle. The broadcast implicitly delivered a devastatingly effective message. If a disabled black man could achieve such spectacular elevation through pure hard work, then the system itself could not be racist. The millions watching purchased his smile, entirely insulating themselves from the blood pooling in his shoe. Bates was a man of profound intelligence. He was navigating the razor-thin margins of mid-century racial politics, and he was entirely aware of the role he had been cast to play. He understood the mechanics of the television industry just as clearly as he had understood the exploitative contracts of the TOBA circuit decades earlier. The network executives were not paying him premium rates because they respected the polyrhythmic traditions of African American dance. They were paying him because his presence sanitized the network's image and delivered massive, uncontroversial ratings. He remained fundamentally a novelty act, albeit one elevated to the highest possible technological platform. The pressure to maintain this specific non-threatening persona was immense. The television cameras demanded a flawless performance of joy. Bates was never permitted to display fatigue. He was never permitted to discuss the systemic poverty that had placed him in the cottonseed oil mill, nor the segregated hospital that had refused to treat his shattered leg. The narrative of his life was strictly curated to begin at the moment of his triumph, erasing entirely the systemic violence that had necessitated his struggle. He was required to be a two-dimensional beacon of inspiration, a man whose entire existence was defined by a cheerful, athletic gratitude. This requirement forced him into a state of profound psychological isolation. He was an icon within the black community, revered for his undeniable talent and his ability to infiltrate the highest echelons of white entertainment. Yet, the very mechanism of his success required him to serve as the smiling alibi for a white supremacist power structure. He was generating wealth, securing his family's future, and breaking unprecedented broadcasting barriers. But he was doing so by allowing his trauma to be packaged as a tranquilizer for the American conscience. The physical toll of this primetime illusion was equally staggering. A reality kept strictly hidden from the studio audiences and the camera lenses. Television, unlike the darkened vaudeville theaters, was an unforgiving medium. The high-definition lighting and tight camera angles required absolute precision. The physical demands he placed on his body to achieve the necessary velocity and height for his signature leaps were catastrophic. The heavy wooden peg strapped tightly to his thigh was not a medical instrument designed for comfort. It was a blunt force tool. Every time he executed a leap on the Ed Sullivan stage, he was essentially subjecting his body to a controlled car crash. The viewers saw the spectacular elevation and the flawless landing. They did not see the brutal, agonizing friction occurring inside the leather harness. They did not see the way the raw, heavily scarred tissue of his amputation site was ground against the unyielding wood with every percussive strike. The millions of Americans who tuned in on Sunday evenings purchased his smile, his rhythm, and the comforting illusion of a pure meritocracy. They absolutely refused to look at the blood pooling in his shoe. The physical reality of gravity and age eventually dismantles every dancer. But for a man absorbing the shock of a 5-foot vertical drop directly into a severed femur, the biological clock operates with brutal acceleration. By the early 1950s, Clayton Bates was navigating his mid-40s. The vaudeville circuits that had launched him were completely dead, replaced by the flickering glow of the television set. He was a fixture on national broadcasts, earning a premium salary, but he possessed a cold, pragmatic understanding of the American entertainment apparatus. The television industry was an insatiable machine. It fed on novelty. Bates knew with absolute certainty that the moment his remaining joints deteriorated, or the moment the viewing public simply grew bored of the peg-leg wonder, the network executives would sever his contracts without a fraction of a second of hesitation. There would be no retirement pension from CBS. There was no institutional safety net waiting to catch a disabled black performer in the mid-20th century. He refused to be discarded a second time. The first time, he was a 12-year-old boy bleeding on a kitchen table, powerless against the industrial architecture of the South. This time, he was a wealthy, internationally recognized figure, and he decided to weaponize the capital he had extracted from the entertainment industry to build his own fortress. The strategy he executed was a masterclass in economic rebellion. He began quietly diverting the massive sums of money generated by his physical exploitation. Every standing ovation, every grueling tap challenge on the Ed Sullivan stage, every night spent enduring the indignities of segregated backstage alleys. He translated that suffering directly into hard currency. He did not spend this wealth on the fleeting, superficial trappings of celebrity. He targeted real estate. In 1951, he turned his attention to the Catskill Mountains in Ulster County, New York. This region, often referred to as the Borscht Belt, was a sprawling, highly lucrative network of summer resorts, catering predominantly to working and middle-class Jewish families from New York City. It was a thriving economy of leisure, entirely built by a marginalized group that had faced its own severe restrictions and anti-Semitism from elite WASP-owned hotels. Yet despite this history of exclusion, the Catskills in the 1950s remained rigidly segregated along racial lines. Black Americans were welcome in these grand resorts only if they were wearing a porter's uniform, carrying luggage, or entering through the kitchen delivery doors to cook the meals. Bates approached white landowners in the rural town of Kerhonkson. The hostility he encountered was immediate and systemic. Real estate agents routinely refused to show him properties. Banks, operating under the federally sanctioned practices of redlining, flatly denied him commercial loans. The local establishment was terrified by the prospect of a black man purchasing prime acreage, fearing it would shatter the racial exclusivity of their resort economy. They attempted to block him through administrative delays, inflated prices, and outright refusals to negotiate. He bypassed the financial institutions entirely. He arrived at closing tables with raw, unassailable cash. He purchased a small, failing farm encompassing roughly 60 acres of land. He did not buy this land to farm. He bought it to establish sovereign territory. Over the next several decades, he poured every ounce of his remaining physical energy and financial resources into transforming that rocky acreage into the Peg Leg Bates Country Club. The logistics of this construction were staggering. He could not rely on standard contractors, many of whom refused to work for a black owner. He hired local laborers, often working directly alongside them, using his immense upper body strength to haul lumber and clear brush when he wasn't required on a television set. He expanded the initial property, systematically purchasing adjoining parcels of land until his estate swelled to over 110 acres. He built a sprawling autonomous infrastructure. He constructed 110 individual guest rooms, a massive dining hall capable of seating hundreds of patrons, a roller skating rink, and a state-of-the-art nightclub. He brought in heavy machinery to excavate the earth, pouring the concrete for the largest swimming pool in Ulster County. In the 1950s, a summer road trip for a black family was not a vacation. It was a highly dangerous, potentially lethal logistical operation. The interstate highways were heavily dotted with sundown towns, municipalities, where local law enforcement and white residents violently prohibited black people from remaining within city limits after dark. Gas stations routinely refused to sell them fuel or allow them to use the restrooms. Motels locked their doors. Families were forced to carry the Negro Motorist Green Book, a vital survival guide listing the rare, scattered locations across the country where they could secure a bed or a meal without the threat of physical assault. The Peg Leg Bates Country Club did not just provide a vacation, it provided a heavily fortified sanctuary. When a black family drove their car through the front gates of his resort in Kerhonkson, the crushing, suffocating weight of Jim Crow America was temporarily lifted from their shoulders. The psychological relief was immense. Inside the boundaries of Bates's property, the rules of the outside world were entirely inverted. Here, black doctors, lawyers, factory workers, and school teachers did not have to avert their eyes or step off the sidewalk. They walked through the main entrance of the dining room. They swam in the Olympic-sized pool without fear of white mobs draining the water in retaliation. Children ran freely across the manicured lawns without their parents constantly scanning the perimeter for threats. The entertainment at the club's nightclub rivaled the finest venues in Manhattan, but with a critical difference in power dynamics. Bates booked the greatest musical acts of the century: Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, Louis Armstrong, Nat King Cole. These legends, who were routinely forced to endure the humiliating segregation policies of the Cotton Club or the Las Vegas Strip, came to Kerhonkson and performed on a stage owned and operated by a black man. They slept in premium guest rooms, ate in the main dining hall, and were treated with absolute uncompromising dignity. Sidney Poitier, Sammy Davis Jr., and Joe Louis were regular guests, finding refuge in the hills of New York. Bates had successfully engineered a monumental act of historical vengeance. The American industrial system, symbolized by the cottonseed oil mill in South Carolina, had violently stripped him of his leg, denied him compensation, and expected him to die in poverty. The American entertainment system had commodified his trauma, forcing him to smile through exhaustion while denying him basic civil rights. In response, he took their money and built the exact social and economic safety net they had refused to provide. He became the largest black landowner in Ulster County. He employed hundreds of black workers, providing them with fair wages and safe working conditions that were entirely unavailable to them in the surrounding rural economy. He was no longer just the one-legged wonder spinning for the amusement of a white audience. He was the architect of an empire. He patrolled the grounds of his country club, greeting families, managing the ledgers, and ensuring the absolute security of his patrons. The wooden peg that had once pounded out rhythms of desperate survival on the dirt roads of the South was now firmly planted on the hardwood floors of his own estate. He had forced the system to fund his own liberation, creating an oasis of joy and dignity in the middle of a deeply hostile nation. The physical architecture of the human body has a finite capacity for shock absorption, regardless of the willpower directing it. By the late 1980s, the decades of violent kinetic impact had finally collected their debt. The heavy wooden peg had pounded against the stages of Harlem, the slick floors of television studios, and the hard wood of his own country club for more than half a century. The joints of his remaining right leg, forced to carry the asymmetrical burden of his explosive choreography, were severely deteriorated. The sheer stamina required to manage the massive sprawling estate in Kerhonkson waned. In 1989, facing the undeniable realities of advancing age and physical decline, Clayton Bates sold the Peg Leg Bates Country Club. The sanctuary he had built from the diverted profits of his own exploitation changed hands, and the architect of that empire quietly stepped away from the relentless demands of his creation. He made a decision that carried a profound, almost chilling psychological weight. He chose to return to Fountain Inn, South Carolina. He traveled back to the exact geographical coordinates of his initial destruction. He returned to the very same municipal borders where the cottonseed oil mill had mangled his 12-year-old body. He returned to the jurisdiction where a segregated hospital had locked its doors to a bleeding child, forcing his mother to hold him down on a wooden kitchen table. The industrial landscape of the American South had modernized in his absence. The rusted gears and exposed drive belts of the early 20th century agricultural machine had been largely dismantled, replaced by new economic engines. Yet the deep foundational currents of racial and economic hierarchy remained firmly embedded in the soil. He was no longer the discarded, impoverished sharecropper's son. He was a wealthy, internationally recognized octogenarian. He had forced the world to acknowledge his existence, and now he positioned himself back at the starting line, a living, breathing testament to the violence the town had attempted to bury. The state apparatus, which had entirely ignored his existence when he was an injured laborer requiring medical intervention, now recognized a unique public relations opportunity. In the winter of 1998, the political establishment of South Carolina prepared to officially embrace the man they had once treated as industrial waste. A grand ceremony was organized at Hillcrest High School in his hometown. The date was early December. The venue was packed with local dignitaries, political figures, and citizens eager to participate in a highly publicized narrative of racial progress and local pride. The governor's office conferred upon him the Order of the Palmetto. This is the highest civilian honor awarded by the state of South Carolina, recognizing individuals for extraordinary lifetime achievement and service to the state. The optics of the event were meticulously managed. The cameras flashed. The politician smiled warmly, shaking the hand of the 91-year-old tap dancer. They pinned the prestigious medal to his lapel. The applause that filled the auditorium was thunderous, echoing the standing ovations of the Broadway theaters and the television studios from decades past. However, beneath the polished surface of this civic celebration lay a severe, deeply unsettling dissonance. The state was not apologizing for the unregulated industrial conditions that cost him his leg. The state was not offering reparations for the legally enforced segregation that denied him anesthetic and a sterilized operating room in 1919. The state was merely capitalizing on the overcomer narrative that the media had constructed around him. By pinning a medal on his chest, the political establishment effectively sanitized its own history. They celebrated his extraordinary resilience as a localized triumph, conveniently omitting the brutal fact that his resilience was only necessary because their specific legal and economic systems had attempted to crush him. They were applauding the survivor while actively erasing their role as the architect of his suffering. Bates, ever the consummate professional, accepted the honor. He understood the mechanics of the public stage better than anyone in the room. He delivered the expected grace. He smiled for the photographs, allowing the establishment to extract their desired narrative of closure and reconciliation. He called it the proudest moment of his life, delivering the precise emotional validation the audience required. The ceremony concluded, the dignitaries dispersed, and the political machinery considered the ledger balanced. The timing of what happened next possessed a stark, almost violent finality. On December 6, 1998, just a day after receiving the state's highest honor, Clayton Bates collapsed while preparing to attend church services. His body could endure no more. He passed away 2 days later on December 8th, just a few miles from the site of the long demolished cotton mill. The abruptness of his death immediately following the state's recognition highlights a dark, recurring pattern in how society interacts with marginalized figures who challenge the status quo. The establishment is highly comfortable honoring a rebel only at the precise moment that the rebellion ends. They awarded him the medal when his physical power was entirely depleted, when he was safely confined to the margins of old age, and when his capacity to actively disrupt the system had expired. Following his death, the town of Fountain Inn commissioned a monument. They erected a life-sized bronze statue of Clayton Bates in the courtyard in front of City Hall. The statue depicts him in mid-performance, leaning heavily on the wooden peg, a wide, frozen smile cast permanently into the metal. The bronze star, too, serves as the ultimate chilling conclusion to the commercialization of his existence. A monument is a tool of historical amnesia. It is designed to replace the complex, painful reality of a human life with a static, uncomplicated symbol. The bronze version of Bates does not bleed. The bronze version does not feel the agonizing friction of a wooden socket rubbing against scar tissue. The bronze version does not remember the suffocating coal dust of the segregated train carriages, nor does it recall the indignity of being forced to eat dinner in the alleyways behind the Harlem nightclubs. The statue is silent, completely neutralized, and infinitely. It allows the descendants of the society that marginalized him to walk past City Hall, look at the smiling metal figure, and feel a warm, unearned sense of civic pride, completely insulated from the horrific systemic failures that necessitated his struggle. The vaudeville theaters have been demolished. The Ed Sullivan Show has been relegated to the archives. The heavy machinery of 20th century entertainment has rusted away, much like the gears of the cottonseed oil mill. But the life of Clayton Bates leaves behind a heavy, unresolved inheritance. Beyond the standing ovations, the television broadcasts, and the silent bronze statues, a deeper question remains. When society forces an individual to monetize their deepest trauma just to survive, are we witnessing a triumph of the human spirit or a tragic failure of the system?